Hello, everybody. Uh, uh, Welcome all panelists and our viewers. This is an intercluster roundtable between the environmental cluster and the international relations cluster at Nickel and Dime, which is the research and publication forum at Center for New Economic Studies. Our theme for today's roundtable is environmental governance, with special emphasis on India and China. Environmental governance refers to the set of regulatory processes, mechanisms, and organizations through which political actors influence environmental actions and outcomes. Governance is not the same as government, and therefore it includes the actions of the state, and in addition encompasses actors such as communities, businesses, NGOs. Now, key to different forms of environmental governance are the political economic relationships that institutions embody and how these relationships shape identities, actions, and outcomes. International accords, national policies and legislation, local decision-making structures, transnational institutions, and environmental NGOs are all examples of the forms through which environmental governance can take place. To streamline action against climate change, an effective climate governance strategy and system is required. As the most recent IPCC report suggests, there have been changes in Earth's climate in every region across the whole climatic system. Many changes are unprecedented in thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. The forest fires and the floods, which are ravaging across Europe, are testament to the fact that urgent action is required, and urgent action can only come through a proper and streamlined strategy of climate governance, of environmental governance. Today we are joined by Yashashvi, Sushmendra, Sagara, Rajat, Neeraja, and Ashika. Dipanshu and I, Krishanu, will be your moderators. With this, I pass on to Dipanshu to ask the first question for today. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, am I audible now?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Krishanu. I think the discussion around environmental governance is especially very necessary in the current time, and as you highlighted. So I think this brings us to the question of what is the ideal climate governance structure, and does it need to be centralized or decentralized? And what are some limitations to the method that can be put, that are there?
So I don't know if there can be any ideal structure that we can propose, but there are some features that I think we can learn from all past agreements and accords that have been formed. Obviously, it has to be a concerted effort, a collaborative effort that is taken by all countries, multilateral agreements in that sense, because if climate change sees no boundaries and territories, how can the efforts been taken by us see them? The flaws of the current multilateral agreements, I believe, are they often seem to be pandering to the Western thought or the Western belief. And since those are the countries which have traditionally been in power, the decisions are swayed in their interests. And we sort of need to leave behind this self-centered, self-interest way of thinking so that it truly is a win-win situation for everybody who's a part of this agreement. While I also did mention that this must be a collaborative effort, but to truly be successful and be maximized in efficiency, we cannot just let those sitting in comfortable conference rooms be the ones making all the decisions. For this to truly be successful, we need to equip the local and regional bodies as well, so that they are the ones who know their country best. They are the ones who know their regions best. So they will be able to actually implement the changes that bigger accords and agreements decide. So while it should be centralized in the effort that is being done, for its efficiency to be maximized, it should be decentralized and everybody should be left to make decisions for themselves.
Am I audible? Yeah. Yeah, continuing off of what Yashasvi said, yeah, I think decentralization is the way to go, at least in the Indian context, not only because of the increase in efficiency that comes with having a decentralized action plan, but I also think while on one hand, centralized directives might be essential to address the kind of immense scale of coordination that we need to achieve climate policy objectives, especially for a nation like India. But at the same time, when you have a central authority like the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change in India, which has almost absolute control over environmental policies, what happens is that these directives can then be easily compromised by corporate interests. So in the absence of sufficient checks and balances through a decentralized system, it becomes very dangerous and it becomes very easy for environmental policies to become extremely difficult to implement at the national and state levels. So in such a structure like the one present in India, it's a decentralized form of governance would be more beneficial. For example, I can think of the Forest Rights Act, which actually has the provisions that allow the implementation of environmental policies at the district and sub-district level and setting up committees that have locally elected representatives. But these provisions are being actively hindered by the Ministry of Environmental and Climate Change because they believe that it would hinder their own ability to continue fostering corporate interests because they have vested interests in exploiting these communities that would be involved in implementing the Forest Rights Act. So if the environmental governance system in India was more decentralized, we wouldn't have this issue. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
Rajat, you had raised your hand. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so both Yashasvi and Sagra brought up interesting point. I would like to give a real world example because I have worked in a field pertaining to Forest Rights Act. So one of the problem which is faced by the entire globe, I would say, is the fact that there is a clear neglect when it comes to understanding the complexities about decentralizations in general, right? So one of the push which came in being after 1970s was the fact to argue a lot about the grassroots movements, grassroots governments, decentralizations, and those things are nice. They work out in most of the cases, but the real problem is sometimes we do not understand that the community is not a homogenized set of people. They also have their own set of politics, their own sets of opinion and interest. So in case of Forest Rights Act, while the SDC and the DC, the sub-district committee and the district committee have the rights to pass the claims of the tribes, the scheduled tribes, most of the times they also tend to limit themselves while exercising their authority because they have their own local political interests. So while it's nice to hear these stories and argue for a decentralized approach, it is also very much important to understand that there are real challenges when it comes to decentralized approaches. I'm not suggesting that we should move away from that, but to make it more effective, it is very much important to understand the complexities. The same one more example which I can bring to the table is from Bangalore. So Bangalore has a lot of commons, a lot of lakes, right? And those lakes are governed by many stakeholders. So some lakes are governed by the BBMP, while some are governed by the local RWAs, some are governed by the local communities as well, and some are governed by citizen groups, the civil society, right? But all of them, if you see, there are cases while the lakes governed by BBMP are in better condition, while the lakes which are governed by the civic groups at present are meeting a lot of challenges. So yeah, that's my view on this, and I guess the first part of the problem is to acknowledge the real challenges, and then only you can move forward to reimagine a new way of governing environment and climate in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you, Rajat. That was insightful, and I guess the problems in decentralization sometimes might be present in the fact that they don't really have the resources, and because the resources are actually present in the central with central authority rather than, so there are certainly there are obstacles to having those resources at your disposal. So let us move on to the second question, that is, can we condense Indian environmental governance to just environment versus development? Does addressing environmental governance in India automatically give into this trade-off that it is either environment or it is development? Uh, what do you all have to say about this? Anybody?
I could take this up.
Sure.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Right. Yeah. So I think we can connect this point to what Rajat was mentioning right before regarding the gaps, right, in when you're talking about central versus decentralized institutions. There were certain gaps which are currently, I think, being filled by NGOs and civil societies with regards to what the communities on ground want versus what the policies that are sent out by the state and the central. You can see often that there is a lack of implementation on the ground, at least proper implementation on the ground. So I think that is the point where you understand that if that gap is filled, this argument of environment versus development could to some extent be solved, right? Because when the policies are rolled out, it is in part uh, development focused, but they do give out some policies for the communities on ground, for the forests around, for the land. But when it comes to the ground, none of those policies are implemented. The funds are diverted to other things. These are the issues. So that if that gap between the central and the grassroots can be filled, I think that this issue can be solved to some extent.
While I do believe that no government decision or a set of government decisions can be divided into this very broad binary, right? Like it's either just for development or just for environment, sustainability. I do feel that there is a growing theme of how the decisions that are being taken and they are following that theme, which sort of do suggest that, well, it's against the environment or that's just not a priority. In 2018, there was for the first time in India, there was no union minister, no separate union minister for forest, environment, and climate change. There was a 25% budget cut from this ministry. Decisions such as these, they probably just persuade us to believe that this is no longer a priority for the Indian government.
Yeah. So I have a couple of things to add here. Good points. Rather than imagining or commenting upon what should be the case, I would rather bring into the picture what has been the case. So when it comes to environmental governance in India in general, it has always been reactionary in nature, and part of it has to do with the idea of development itself. So if we were to frame the whole concept of development, it's not like that there is only one idea of development, right? In the academic domain and in general also, there exist a lot of ideas which conceptualized development in many ways, like Amartya Sen's idea and stuff like that. But there is definite push of some ideas which then become hegemonic in nature, and then sort of starts governing the entire nation in a way which pushed back the agenda which the real people, like which people on the ground want, right? So talking about the environmental governance in India, as I said, it has always been reactionary, right? So there existed a good equilibrium between environment and people before the invader came, right? Before the colonial intervention in our country. But then they took up on their shoulders to make it a case that they wanted to exploit the resources, right? And they didn't bring in any law till the time they realized that the resources are limited, right? But then when they brought up laws to govern the resources, those were not to protect the environment or forest, right? Those were to protect their own resources, to push people away. And surprisingly enough, the same policies have been followed by India post independence, right? One would find it counterintuitive, but that has been the case. So to understand this debate, one also has to understand that why some ideas become more hegemonic in nature, and why the ideas which already pertain and are already existing in a society starts to dwindle and starts to get limited view and limited acceptance. Most, like, even today I was reading a newspaper and the Haryana government has changed their land laws, right? Now, under their new PPP policy, they any new project do not have to conform to the social impact assessment, which can't be the case in a world where we are living. No project should be accepted like that. But even though we have IPCC guidelines, we have all the laws, you can see that there is a definite push to follow a certain model of development and to be like some other country, which has been the case throughout the academic history, throughout the journal history as well. And also the urban history also signals and shows the same kind of example. So we have followed a certain kind of city planning and urban planning uh, as propagated by the Western ideas. Even though there exists a strong body of knowledge which argues to understand cities from where we are living, like the southern urban theory, right? But yeah, for me, what's interesting is to understand that why some ideas become hegemonic. So yeah, I don't know what could be the solution, but there are real challenges on ground.
Neeraja, you had raised your hand.
Yeah, so what I wanted to add is, in a conversation like this, uh, priorities of the people living in the country and standard of living really comes to play. The government can work towards pushing the needs of people when the people really want it. Now, taking India into consideration, there are so many problems like literacy rate, lack of education, mortality rate, healthcare facilities, so many other things that are really nagging us right now. So, in a situation like this, when the government pushes towards, environmental, focusing on environmental development, it becomes really hard to look at. So, yeah, that's all I wanted.
Sagra, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Rajat was mentioning about the impact of colonialism on what India defines as conservation, what India defines as development. You can find that that perception pretty much grounded in the legislature that India follows with respect to the environment. So going back to the Forest Rights Act, so the Forest Rights Act was actually like a groundbreaking piece of legislature, but a lot of the things that are mentioned in the Forest Rights Act are considered forest offenses under the Indian Forest Act, which was, I think, implemented during the colonial era. So the Indian Forest Act was inherently exploitative, and it was just governing forest resources to further the exploitation of those resources. And the fact that the Indian Environment Ministry continues to prefer the Indian Forest Act over the FRA, despite the expansive measures for conservation that are mentioned in the FRA, just goes on to show that those hegemonic ideas of conservation that originated with the British still continue to influence the way we see conservation in India today, and continue to influence the way we conserve our own resources, or we don't conserve them.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I can go ahead. I just wanted to kind of counter Neeraja's point. Neeraj, you had mentioned that there are important, if there are various other important issues in India which kind of overshadow the environment issues, right? But if you think like, well, caste is a big issue in India, right? And there are certain areas within caste that are also considered a big issue. For example, sanitation, right? And the labor for sanitation, right? There are other countries, right, which have kind of linked this issue of sanitation to environment, to public health, to which further will increase their living standards. And they've kind of formed this like blanket sort of policy which covers everything. So when you acknowledge that environment is not just an issue of itself, that it's a linkage between multiple social issues, I think that you'll understand that it is a pretty important fact. In fact, rather than overshadowing it, it is on the equal plane. yeah, that's just my 2 cents on it.
Thank you, Ashika.
Yeah, these make a lot of sense. And, we did cover a lot of different perspectives in this question. And what stood out to me particularly was the discussion about India and, a larger kind of global narrative that could be taken place. And I think if I remember correctly, it was Nirja who pointed out that the government needs to act in accordance with the people, and what the people want needs to be, really assessed. So that kind of takes us to the next question, which was whether India so we know that India and China have backed out from the coal phase out as prescribed by the Paris Agreement due to several reasons regarding development, loss of jobs, etc. And these are also, seen as in accordance with what the people want, quote unquote. So in such a case, what do you all feel that international environmental governance programs lack, and how should one counter them?
If I may go first, sorry, I have a couple points on this. I'm sorry if I go on for a bit long. But yeah, what I can recall when I hear about this is there was a recent interview with Arjun Appadurai where he mentioned that India has some of the best laws in the world, even in terms of environmental governance, but for every single one of those laws, we have almost zero compliance. And this is something we've discussed so far, even in the previous questions, about how implementation is pretty much one of the major problems with environmental laws. And this is the same thing for international environmental governance programs, which is that they have all the provisions required to prevent climate disaster, but they have very minimum provisions to actually ensure compliance to these measures. So on one hand, you can take a very narrow, realist IR 101 perspective on this and say that, yeah, the international system is inherently anarchic and nations will only pursue their own national interests. So they have no inherent incentive to comply to these governance programs. However, if you define national interest through the lens of environmental conservation, through the lens of protecting the ecological health of the nation, then environment actually becomes a matter of national interest and generates the required political will that is required to implement these measures that are mentioned in these agreements. So it's not that compliance is an impossible task in the international environmental governance system, but it's simply not given enough attention when you actually draft these multilateral environmental agreements. So there was actually a paper that was released back in 2007 that actually highlighted this issue and mentioned that the international environmental governance system is a system of negotiation and not a system of implementation. So what that means is you spend so much time and energy and resources into making sure that you draft an agreement that is agreeable to all parties, that you don't spend enough time trying to figure out how these measures will actually be implemented in each one of these countries. So what happens when you have a system like that is you get agreements like the Paris Agreement, which is broad and very vast and has 197 signatories, but very few countries that are actually on the path to achieving the targets that they've set for themselves under the Paris Agreement. So this is a major flaw of the international environmental governance system as it exists today. But it's not that, again, it's not, this is not to say that it's completely impossible to have success stories in this system, because it's in this very same system that we had the Montreal Protocol, which was signed in 1987. And that was a protocol that had pretty much all the nations on Earth had signed the Montreal Protocol. And it is the most successful protocol so far, because every party that signed to the protocol has reduced the ozone depleting substances by 98%. So that is a goal that is reached solidly across every single party. And what was key to that success was combining the persuasive compliance measures that were mentioned in the agreement along with hardcore funding for developing countries. So there was a UN agency that was specifically designed to work with developing countries and help them design a plan of action to get back on track with compliance when they're not complying with their own goals. And at the same time, there was also a multilateral fund that these countries would access whatever funds that they needed in order to comply with the goals, no matter how vast or no matter how much of a long shot it may have seemed like. So these measures are seen to have been producing successes in the past, but there has not been enough focus on these measures in the kind of multilateral agreements that have been signed in the past few decades. So what we need to do in the international environmental governance system is to bring these measures back into the center of the discussion instead of the periphery, and focus more on implementation rather than negotiating parameters that are acceptable to every single country on the planet. Yeah.
Thank you, Sagara. Those were very interesting points. Ashika, you can take over.
Yeah, I just had a question with regards to Sagar as well. I think Dipanshu, while introducing the question, had mentioned, kind of connected this to Neeraja's point of, that the government has like a responsibility to the people, right, to do what they want. So, what these persuasive compliance measures that you were talking about, how would that kind of go along with what the people want? Because if they pull out, for example, the coal phase out situation, if they completely pull out, a lot of people are losing jobs. And since it's largely a localized issue, specifically in India, it's in a few states, these large coal mines. So a lot of people in those states, and the states' revenues largely depend on this. So this persuasive compliance measures, how will it sort of go along with what the people want?
So that's
Can
the
I
thing.
just
Sorry, yeah, continue.
I just want to add something on similar lines. You also mentioned about how it should not be geared towards national interest, or we should make it seem like it's in everyone's national interest to encourage them to participate, and then obviously that would result in implementation and sustainability of those measures. But how do you form something in such a way that it looks like it's to their national interest? What if it's just not something they want to do? In India itself, I think in 2014 or 16, there were amendments which increased the power of the state governments to sort of grant environmental clearances, especially in controversial projects such as mines or river clearances. There was also some moves against moves in the Supreme Court to against the National Green Tribunal to exempt real estate sector from the environmental laws. So in cases like these, when it's quite obvious and blatant that this is not a national interest to them, how do you form it in such a way that it seems like a national interest?
So yeah, these are kind of concerns that were, I think, also brought up in the Montreal Protocol thing. And what they had done to address similar issues was that they didn't have punitive measures to stop people from, straying away from whatever goals that they've set for themselves, but they had certain measures that would encourage them to participate. So, for example, in the Montreal Protocol, they had a measure that meant that only the countries that signed the agreement would be able to trade with each other. So what that meant was that if you were not a signatory of the Montreal Protocol, you would not be able to trade with the signatories of Montreal Protocol. So when you had a lot of the major countries in the world, like the most biggest economies signing on to the Montreal Protocol, you couldn't miss out on trading with those countries. And so as a result, it became your national interest to sign the Montreal Protocol. And then combining this with the other measures that I mentioned before of agencies that are designed to help you stay on the track to compliance. And even if you're not complying, help design an action plan that is specific to your country that helps you comply with the goals that you've set for yourself. Combining these with this kind of trade limits that the Montreal Protocol set really helped people adhere to the kind of measures that were mentioned in the protocol. And about what Ashika mentioned about what if it's not what the people want, because it will cause a lot of losses. It's been widely recognized now that the renewable energy industry is cheaper and more labor intensive than the coal industry in India right now, because the coal industry has led to actually more job cuts because it has become increasingly mechanized. So shifting away from coal is actually beneficial for both the people and in terms of the nation's environment. So it will be what the people want, but it comes a matter of political will that will again come through persuasive measures like trade limits, etc., to convince the not only the people of the nation but also the political society that this is what you need to move away from coal and towards renewable sources. Yeah.
Thank you, Sagara. Those were very interesting points and counterpoints on a very, very important topic to discuss. Next, does globalization always produce bad results for environmental governance? How can we leverage this globalization for better climate governance across all levels? You have the national level, you have the subnational levels, which are the state and the regional level. So how can we use this globalization and exposure to global norms and other things to use it for our benefit and use it for streamlining action in terms of environmental governance? Anybody?
I think we can list the jarring drawbacks that globalization has quite obviously caused the environment, but I believe that it has also facilitated one of the most important advantages, which sort of forms the foundation of modern day and future sustainability. Its increase has heightened environmental awareness worldwide. There's greater connectivity, higher rates of international travel. It's made it easier for individuals to see the effects that deforestation, habitat destruction, climate change have had in the environment. This in turn has also the exchange of knowledge, the exchange of uh, anecdotal evidence from each country, the transfer of this information across borders has contributed to the formation of new laws and regulations and processes that in turn will help limit future negative effects. So I think this is one of the biggest advantages that has been brought to us and could have only been brought to us by globalization.
Thank you, Ashish.
I think if I could go next, uh, I mean, to the question as to does globalization always produce negative effects for the environment, I would perhaps say no, because the environmentalists who support this view that globalization leads to environmental degradation believe, I mean, base their argument on 3 points. One is that globalization, which essentially is means one market, leads to an increased demand. The follow-up to this argument is that more demand leads to more production, and the follow-up to this is more production leads to more degradation of the environment, so on and so forth. But I think it would be a much better idea to look at the world as one market, because this will help us in identifying the comparative strengths of one country with respect to the other. I mean, I would like to give the example of Iran when sanctions were imposed in that country. They engaged themselves in refining the crude oil they had, which resulted in 10 times more pollutants than the fuel they imported. So I think it is not a great idea to always say that globalization has a cascading impact on environmental thing.
Thank you.
If I may,
Go ahead, Neeraj.
all right. Um, I want to say that without globalization, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Without globalization, there would be absolutely no awareness regarding this topic. We're able to transmit information from one end of the globe to another because of globalization. We're able to formulate new laws, policies, regulations, all because of globalization. We're even, because of globalization, we're able to understand the gravity of the situation that climate change has caused, on our planet. So I feel like no, globalization does not always produce bad results for this particular topic.
I mean, I see that the conversation is going in in favor of globalization being not environmentally degrading, so to say. But I'd also I'd like to present 2 points. One is in favor of this proposition, and one is just to play the devil's advocate. And I think I'll go with that first, which is to say, I think we are confusing two things over here when we talk about globalization, and then the other thing is neoliberal capitalism. Because then when because most of the times when we see, I think the logic of argument that Sushmendra, I think, gave out, that an increased demand due to globalization leads to more production. Now it's also an idea of what kind of production is that production of goods which are environmentally sustainable, or which are environmentally degrading. Because when you increase demand for more renewable sources of energy, if that increases, then you can have an environment, you can sustain that environmental space. But if those are if that production is motivated by neoliberal capitalist profits, then it might not be the case. This is, one point I wanted to put out, that when we are assessing globalization, we also need to look at it from a more nuanced perspective. And second thing, I'm more sympathetic towards globalization not being environmentally degrading because of the collective action problem. I think the more economies are intertwined and the more economies kind of interact, there's also, a possibility of solving that collective action problem as to why should one nation alone take or bear the brunt of, solving the source, like the environmental crisis. Because globalization allows for more interaction. That means that responsibility can be shared, and there are several mechanisms that through which these responsibilities are shared, or at least are proposed to be shared, which yet, which sometimes are checked by neoliberal interests. But again, like, that is something that, one needs to also consider while arguing for or against this proposition, in my opinion.
Thank you, Dipanshu. Yeah, Rajat, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was also thinking that we are defining globalization as a very narrow concept, in the sense that it obviously enables people to communicate and enables transnational sharing of information and stuff like that. That's definitely the case, but I would rather put it as a network society as that exists as a concept. But to think of globalization as an egalitarian concept is also, I think, a mistake, because even in the whole frame of globalization, there are going to be some countries which are going to benefit more than the others, right? And we live in a market society where there is an existing system of exploitation. So in 1970s, there was a book called Limits to Growth, which argued that the resources are limited not for a single country, but for the whole globe, right? And historically, because some countries started developing early, they have reached a point and have utilized the resources to be a certain kind of societies, right? Now, to put all this in the globalization frame, what these multilateral agreements tend to do is that the fact that countries which lack, right, in terms of development, they are also forced to follow a similar trajectory of, limiting themselves when it comes to development. So in that sense, to understand globalization, I'm not saying that it's a pure evil, but definitely not an egalitarian concept, and definitely needs to be rechecked, reframed, and the historical injustice which a lot of countries has faced needs to be addressed before framing all these multilateral agreements and imagining a new kind of market where everyone have equal opportunities and equal say when it comes to resources. Only then the countries which are lacking behind can reach a stage where they can also become, developed in the normative sense. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Rajat, and thank you everybody for very insightful points and counterpoints regarding how to see globalization in terms of environmental governance. And they were very interesting points that came out in favor and also against globalization. So that brings me, and that brings us to our last question. That is based on India and regarding the present and the most recent, developments which have taken place. Do you think that the recent emphasis on self-reliance, or quote unquote Atmanirbharta, would drive out the needed democratization of climate governance and make it more centralized, since it would have to focus more on development than sustainability? What do you feel regarding that? Does Atmanirbharta stand in the way of having a more sustainable climate governance structure? Anybody?
Well, I don't know if it would make this climate governance structure in India more centralized as such, or at least not more centralized than it is already. But I do think it will shift the focus away from sustainable growth, because the Atmanirbharta package that was proposed of around like 20 trillion rupees has been essentially presented as something that is designed to revive the economy post the pandemic. But it's reviving it by maintaining the status quo and not by pushing for a more green path of growth. So the kind of Atmanirbharta that they are envisioning here is one that's very short-sighted, because it seems to be focused on only addressing the immediate concerns that are caused by the pandemic and not the long-term consequences of climate change and what impact that they might have on India's ability to be self-reliable. So funds for climate change mitigation and adaptation should have been a major part of any plan that is realistically meant to increase the self-reliability of a nation. But instead, this Atmanirbharta project is just an attempt to address the kind of like supply chain disruptions that were caused by the pandemic, which is simply not enough to tackle a long-term problem like climate change.
Yeah, and if I could add something to that, like what you said, it's about supply chains and all, uh, like uh, like giving the example of coal. The things that were imported earlier from other countries are now to be harvested from within the country itself. And for that, you have to clear so many protected areas, which were before the hubs of environmental protection, etc. Now they have to be converted into minefields, etc., in order for you to fill the void that has been left off by lack of imports in the name of Atmanirbharta. So I think it's a very fine thread that that we have to walk in on, if we really want that our Atmanirbharta strategy be aligned to sustainability. And I guess it would call for tough decisions. Anybody else would like to add something to that, to the question? You can go ahead.
I think to add to Sagra's point, it's important to understand why this whole emphasis shifted towards being self-reliant or Atmanirbhar. It stemmed from one, the supply chain disruptions, and two, it started with this slight war we had with China, and the fact that it is not they are not a very reliable partner. I would like to quote the example of what happened in 2017-18 in a place called Tuticorin in Tamil Nadu, wherein a lot of locals started protesting that the copper sterlite plant in their area was turning out to be a health hazard. Now, say that event happens in 2021, what would our response be? Because that plant alone produced 40% of India's copper needs, and shutting down of that plant had made India a net importer of copper from a net exporter of copper. So this concept of Atmanirbhar Bharat may not accommodate the fact that we may have to rely on imports from outside India.
If I may add to Sushmendra's point, yeah, and this contradiction between our insistence on focusing on your own production is again harming our own commitments to the Paris Climate Agreement, because we promise to ensure cheap and efficient installment of renewable energy sources, but that would involve importing from abroad. But then importing from abroad becomes a lot more difficult because of the tariffs imposed on imports that comes under the Atmanirbhar scheme. So once again, you're harming your own goals towards achieving the towards what we committed in the Paris Climate Agreement, purely because of the Atmanirbhar agenda.
Rajat, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so I don't know how far this comment of mine is going to answer the question, but I would like to digress a bit and comment on the general governance which is happening in India over the past few years. So there exists a conundrum when it comes to governance in India, that there is a push to over-govern and underutilize the existing structures. So even in terms of Atmanirbhar, right? So you are pushing people to be self-reliant, but you are not providing them with required structures. so as to be self-reliant, right? So there exists that dilemma that is definitely going to affect the overall governance. Secondly, I also believe that the whole debate of over the past few years, obviously, this has become a norm that whenever the government provides some sort of welfare, they think of it as a token which they are giving to the public, right? While welfare is a right of the citizen of any country, right? As like this is not my argument, this is an argument which is made by Pratap Bhanu Mehta. So I feel like this constant push towards self-reliance is also some sort of a push to invisibilize the whole idea of welfare in general, so that to silence the demands of the public. And I also believe that this is going to affect the climate governance and environmental governance in large, because definitely it's interlinked. That's what I believe. Yeah.
Thank you, Rajat. Thank you for your inputs.
Okay. I think we had a really productive discussion, and I think before we move on from this question and we close today's discussion, I just wanted to say apply the same kind of concept that we talked about for globalization to Atmanirbharta also. That we need not look at it in very narrow terms. That it is meant for only development, and development is always exclusive of sustainability. If we define Atmanirbharta or self-reliance in a way that it needs to be sustainable as well for future generations to kind of sustain that self-reliant growth or Atmanirbhar, economy, then I think we can move forward. There's nothing stopping us to being self-reliant and sustainable in this field. And I think, as you know, our discussion covered largely also that there are some existing frameworks, but I think the problem mainly that came out to be was that of implementation and basically sustenance of those sustainability measures, so to say, because there still are definitely many loopholes which still need to be acknowledged and overcome. So it's not just environmental governance, but also implementation of those governance schemes, in my opinion, that was highlighted, that stood out to me personally in today's discussion. So on that note, I think thank you everyone for taking the time out to attend this and having this very productive discussion today. And we look forward to more such discussions. And thank you for all the listeners who viewed this and engaged with this. And look forward for more discussions like this. Till then, stay tuned to our social media channels and our website for more updates. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.